Chapter 151, The Emerald Shield. Time skip 4 moons. The winter had deepened with a slow, grinding cruelty. The gray skies had bled into long, dark nights, and the snow had piled high against the trunks of the ancient sentinel pines. The vast, sprawling camp of the wildlings, pressed tightly between the tree line of the haunted forest and the towering blue cliff of Castle Black, had become a grim place of survival. 100,000 men, women, and children huddled around their hearth fires, waiting for the cold to finally reveal its teeth. Near the eastern edge of the camp, sitting cross-legged in the freezing snow beneath a heavy canvas tent, a wildling named Boric sat completely motionless. He was a warg, a man whose mind could slip its human tether and ride in the skin of beasts. Boric's thick, scarred face was pale. His eyes rolled completely back into his skull, showing only the whites. He did not feel the biting wind tearing at his heavy bear fur cloak. He felt only the crisp, thin air of the high altitudes, the rushing of the wind through thick, feathered wings, and the sharp, piercing vision of a snow owl gliding silently over the canopy of the haunted forest. For weeks, the deep woods had been empty, a vast expanse of sleeping timber and undisturbed drifts. But today the quiet was broken. Through the eyes of the owl, Boric looked down at a wide, snow-choked valley nearly a league north of the wildling camps. The valley was moving. It was not a herd of migrating elk or a pack of starving wolves. It was a tide of rotting flesh. Thousands upon thousands of figures marched through the deep snow. They moved with a jerky, relentless rhythm, making no sound, their weight somehow carrying them lightly over the powder. They were the corpses of wildlings, Night's Watch rangers, and long-dead beasts. Skinless bears and rotting stags marched alongside skeletal men wielding rusted iron and broken bone. And moving slowly behind the vanguard of the dead, riding atop the pale, rotting corpses of dead horses, were the masters of the cold. The White Walkers sat tall in their saddles, their armor of shattered ice catching the dull gray light of the morning. In the center of the Pale Riders rode a figure crowned in jagged horns of ice, his piercing blue eyes fixed entirely on the southern horizon. High above, the snow owl let out a sharp, frightened screech. The sheer, unnatural cold radiating from the marching host struck the bird like a physical blow. In the wildling camp, Boric gasped sharply. His eyes rolled forward, the pupils snapping back into focus. He pitched forward into the snow, coughing violently as his human lungs fought to remember how to breathe. He tasted raw blood in the back of his throat, and coughed up a tiny, frozen pellet of mouse bones. A grim, disorienting toll of riding the bird too deeply. His hands trembled, his blood running colder than the frost around him. He pushed himself up from the dirt, ignoring the heavy ache in his bones, and broke into a heavy, desperate run through the crowded tents. Boric tore past the hearth fires, shoving his way through crowds of spearwives and heavily bearded raiders. He did not stop to answer their angry curses. He ran until his chest burned, bursting through the heavy hide flaps of the largest tent in the center of the camp. Mance Raider stood over a rough stone table, tracing lines on a worn piece of sheepskin parchment with Tormund Giantsbane. The king beyond the wall looked up as the warg stumbled into the tent, gasping for air, his face as white as milk. "Boric," Mance said, his voice dropping to a low, heavy pitch. He did not need to ask. He saw the stark terror in the man's eyes. "They are here," Boric rasped, leaning heavily against the wooden tent pole to keep his legs from collapsing. "A tide of them, Mance, filling the valleys, walking through the trees. They are less than 5 leagues away." Mance's jaw set into a hard, grim line. "How many?" Tormund grunted, his hand dropping to the heavy, dragon-glass-tipped axe at his belt. "Too many to count," Boric swallowed hard. "The dead, the Pale Riders, and the king with the horns of ice. They are marching straight for the wall." Mance did not waste a single second on fear. He turned to Tormund, his eyes sharp and commanding. "Sound the horns," Mance ordered, his voice ringing with the heavy authority of his crown. 3 long blasts. Tell the clans to abandon the tents. Leave the furs, leave the heavy meat, leave the wagons. Take only the weapons in your hands and the clothes on your backs. Get the women, the children, and the elders moving for the tunnel immediately." Tormund gave a single, firm nod. He turned and rushed from the tent, shouting for the hornblowers. Mance grabbed his heavy sword and his red-slashed cloak. He strode out into the freezing morning air, walking briskly toward the massive, weeping face of the wall. A moment later, The deep, mournful wail of a massive war horn echoed across the sprawling camp. It blew once, a long, low note that rattled the snow from the pine branches. A heartbeat later, it blew again and again. 3 blasts. The camp erupted. The low murmur of morning chores turned into a sudden, chaotic roar of panic. Men and women shouted, grabbing their children by the arms and pulling them from the tents. Thousands of people, realizing the long dark had finally caught them, abandoned their meager belongings and surged toward the southern edge of the clearing, pressing tightly against the base of the great ice. Mance and Tormund pushed through the surging crowd, making their way to the heavy iron grate that blocked the entrance to the deep tunnel of Castle Black. Standing on the other side of the rusted iron bars, flanked by heavily armed brothers of the Night's Watch, was Lord Commander Jeor Mormont. "The dead are on our heels, Mormont," Mance shouted through the bars, his voice cutting through the noise of the panicked horde behind him. "They have broken the tree line. Open the gates." Mormont looked at the Wildling King. For decades, the Night's Watch had fought the free folk, bleeding them in the snow and hunting them through the deep woods. But Jeor Mormont was a man of the North, and he had sworn a heavy oath to Eddard Stark. The Warden of the North had struck a bargain, and the old bear would not break it. Mormont turned to the men manning the heavy wooden winches set deep into the tunnel walls. "Draw the portcullis," Mormont roared, his voice echoing loudly in the frozen throat of the wall. "Open the gates." The Black brothers threw their weight against the heavy wooden levers. The thick iron chains groaned in protest, grinding harshly against the ice. Slowly, the massive, rusted iron grate began to lift, tearing free from the frozen mud at its base. The thick, inner wooden doors were pushed wide open, revealing the long, dark passage that led to the safety of the southern courtyards. As the gate opened, Mormont stepped forward, meeting Mance at the threshold. "The trenches are primed, Raider," Mormont warned, his voice low and deadly serious. Over the last 7 years, the Wildlings and the Black brothers had dug a deep, massive semicircular trench in the snow, ringing the entire camp. They had buried hundreds of heavy clay jars within the dirt, packing them carefully with damp sand. "I know," Mance replied, gripping his sword. "Do not light them early," Mormont cautioned, his eyes hard. "If the wind catches the flames before the dead are upon the dirt, it will blow the fire back into your own retreating people. Wait until the whites are stepping on the trench line. Then you loose the fire. I will hold the line until the women are through," Mance promised. Mance turned back to the chaotic, surging mass of wildlings. The funneling of 100,000 people into a tunnel wide enough for only 3 wagons was a desperate, crushing nightmare. Children wept, crushed against the legs of their parents. Near the heavy iron grate, a towering giant roared in the old tongue, desperately trying to force a panicked, bellowing mammoth into the dark passage. The massive beast refused to move, its hooves churning the mud. The giant physically braced his massive, fur-covered shoulders against the mammoth's rear, using every ounce of his tremendous strength to slowly, stubbornly shove the terrified beast forward into the tunnel. "Warriors to the front," Tormund roared, his massive voice booming over the panic. "Spearwives, raiders, form the line. Let the weak pass." 3,000 hardened free folk fighters broke away from the fleeing mob. They did not run for the tunnel. They turned their backs to the wall, marching forward to stand directly behind the hidden, snow-covered trench line. They drew their heavy bows, knocked arrows tipped with dark dragonglass, and leveled their spears of bone and iron. They formed a ragged, desperate rearguard, placing their own bodies between the slow-moving retreat and the dark woods. Mance Rayder stood in the center of the line, his sword drawn, watching the deep shadows of the haunted forest. For a long, agonizing quarter of an hour, the only sounds were the frantic shouts of the camp and the heavy, grinding gears of the tunnel winch behind them. Then, the tree line shattered. It did not break with the loud, roaring battle cry of a charging army. It broke with a heavy, unnatural silence. The whites poured out of the dark pines like a tidal wave of rotting meat and pale bone. Thousands of dead men, their clothes hanging in rags, their flesh torn and blue, sprinted across the snow with a jerky, relentless speed that defied stiff muscles and frozen joints. Their eyes burned with a piercing, uniform blue light, lacking any trace of thought or fear. Behind the sprinting horde of whites, the true masters emerged from the gloom. A dozen white walkers rode slowly into the clearing atop their dead, rotting horses. They watched the wildling camp with cold, detached malice, their crystal spears gleaming in the dim light. They did not rush. They simply directed the tide of the dead toward the narrow funnel of the wall. The air in the clearing plummeted. The biting winter wind suddenly turned into a heavy, suffocating freeze. The wildlings standing in the rearguard felt the moisture in their breaths instantly turn to sharp ice on their beards. "Steady!" Mance shouted, walking up and down the line, his breath pluming in thick white clouds. "Hold your fire. Let them close." The whites charged across the abandoned wildling camp. They trampled over the fallen tents, kicked through the dying hearth fires, and crushed the discarded supplies under their rotting feet. They moved in a blind, rushing sprint, their skeletal hands reaching out, their jaws snapping silently in the freezing air. 50 yards, 40 yards, 30 yards, 20 yards. The front line of the dead hit the edge of the buried trench. "Light them!" Mance roared, his voice tearing from his throat. Along the wildling line, 100 archers quickly dipped the cloth-wrapped tips of their arrows into small, burning pitch braziers they had carried from the camp. They drew their bowstrings tight, aiming not at the charging dead, but directly into the snow-filled trench at their feet. "Loose!" 100 flaming arrows hissed through the cold air in a short, steep arc, plunging directly into the buried clay jars. The ground ruptured. A deafening roar shook the deep ice of the wall, loud enough to crack the frozen stone. A towering, blinding wall of emerald green flame erupted from the snow in a massive, perfect semicircle, completely ringing the free folk camp. The force of the blast blew the front ranks of the charging whites to pieces. Dozens of rotting corpses were lifted entirely off their feet and thrown backward through the air, their brittle bones shattered by the sheer power of the pyromancer's fire. A few of the dead, their bodies engulfed entirely in green flames, were blown completely over the blazing trench and crashed heavily into the dirt directly behind the wildling perimeter. The burning whites thrashed wildly in the mud, forcing the spearwives in the rear to quickly drive their dragonglass spears through the flaming corpses, pinning them to the earth and ending them before the defensive line could reform. The heat radiating from the green fire was sudden and searing. The deep snow surrounding the trench melted in an instant, turning the frozen earth into a thick, boiling stew of hot mud. The wildfire did not behave like burning wood. It did not flicker or seek normal fuel. It burned with a hungry, unnatural ferocity, roaring high into the air, casting an eerie, sickly green glow over the terrified faces of the retreating host. It emitted a foul, biting stench of stale urine, sulfur, and burning pork fat as it consumed the rotting dead. The unnatural, noxious smell forced the wildlings to gag, raising their thick furs to cover their mouths as they backed away from the heat. The horde of the dead crashed to a halt. The whites, driven by the cold magic of their masters, possessed no true fear, but the searing heat of the emerald flames created a physical barrier they could not sprint through. The rotting corpses milled at the edge of the trench, their blue eyes staring blankly at the roaring green fire, unable to cross the roaring threshold. A loud, ragged cheer erupted from the wildling rearguard. The fire held. The line was unbroken. From the back of the dead host, the White Walkers watched the emerald flames with cold, unblinking eyes. The leader of the Pale Riders, the king crowned in jagged ice, raised a single pale hand. He gave a silent command to the horde. The whites stopped milling. Without a single sound of hesitation or protest, the front ranks of the dead threw themselves headfirst into the roaring green trench. Mance Raider's cheer died in his throat. He watched in grim horror as hundreds of whites willingly leaped into the fire. The Night King was using his own vast army as fodder, intending to smother the flames with a thick, heavy bridge of rotting bodies so the rest of the host could cross safely over the ashes. But the Masters of the Cold did not understand the nature of the weapon Ned Stark had brought from the south. This was not a fire built of pine branches and dry moss. As the whites fell into the trench, the wildfire did not smother. Fed. The green flames latched onto the dry bone, the rotting fat, and the old, tattered clothing of the dead. The thick liquid burned impossibly hot, consuming the corpses in a matter of seconds. Instead of building a bridge of bodies, the trench became a roaring, emerald furnace. The fire burned brighter and hotter with every white that threw itself into the pit, the sickly green flames leaping higher into the air, fueled entirely by the flesh of the enemy. The trench did not close. It became an impassable moat of boiling fire. Seeing the tactic fail, the remaining whites stopped their suicidal march, standing motionless at the edge of the blazing trench, trapped on the northern side. "It holds," Tormund yelled, slapping Mance heavily on the shoulder. The green fire eats them whole. Mance did not smile. He looked back at the tunnel. The massive crush of bodies had finally cleared. The last of the wildling women, the slow-moving elders, and the lumbering mammoths had disappeared into the dark safety of the passage. Only the rearguard remained on the northern side of the wall. "Fall back," Mance commanded, raising his sword high. "Into the tunnel. We do not wait for the fire to die." The wildling warriors did not need to be told twice. They turned their backs on the roaring green flames and broke into a heavy, desperate sprint for the heavy iron gates of Castle Black. The heat of the wildfire protected their backs, creating a solid wall between the living and the dead. Mance and Tormund ran at the rear of the pack, ensuring no man was left behind in the snow. Through the roaring, shifting veil of the green flames, a single figure stepped forward from the ranks of the dead. The Night King dismounted from his rotting horse. He walked slowly toward the edge of the blazing trench. The searing, unnatural heat of the wildfire did not seem to touch him. The frost did not melt from his pale, glass-like armor, and his piercing blue eyes did not blink against the smoke. He stopped at the edge of the fire, his gaze locking directly onto the retreating form of the king beyond the wall. The Night King reached down, his long, pale fingers wrapping around the thick haft of a massive, jagged spear forged entirely of clear, dark ice. He lifted the heavy weapon, balancing it smoothly in his grip. He stepped back, his body coiling with cold, unnatural tension, and hurled the spear directly through the roaring green flames. The ice spear flew with terrifying, impossible force. It shrieked through the air, carrying the heavy, driving weight of a falling boulder, aimed flawlessly at the center of Mance Rayder's back as the wildling king sprinted for the open gates. Tormund Giantsbane, running a half-step behind Mance, heard the sharp, splitting whistle of the ice cutting through the air. The massive, red-bearded raider did not have time to shout a warning. He did not have time to draw his axe or raise a shield. Driven by pure, desperate instinct, Tormund threw his massive bulk sideways. He did not simply push the king. He slammed into Mance with the heavy, brutal force of a falling oak tree. The violent tackle knocked the wind completely out of Mance, heavily bruising the king's ribs against the frozen mud just as the massive ice spear shrieked through the space where Mance's chest had been a fraction of a second before. The spear missed the wildlings entirely and struck the heavy, solid stone archway of the tunnel entrance. The impact sounded like a thunderclap. The thick ice spear shattered into 1,000 jagged, razor-sharp shards, exploding outward in a deadly spray of frost. The flying pieces of ice cut deeply into the cheeks and arms of the retreating wildlings. The shards were not just sharp. They were magically, impossibly cold. The wounds did not bleed immediately. The flesh around the deep cuts was flash-frozen solid, turning a dead, sickly black from the mere touch of the walker's weapon. Mance scrambled up from the mud, pulling Tormund roughly to his feet. "Move!" Mance roared, shoving the large man forward, ignoring the throbbing pain in his ribs. They sprinted the final few yards, throwing themselves headlong into the dark, echoing tunnel. They crossed the threshold of the wall, their boots hitting the hard-packed ice of the passage. "Drop the gate!" Jeor Mormont bellowed from the shadows, watching the last of the rearguard clear the entrance. The Black brothers manning the winches released the heavy wooden brakes. The massive, rusted iron portcullis slammed down with a bone-jarring crash, its heavy iron spikes biting deeply into the frozen mud and ice at the base of the tunnel, sealing the passage. Behind the iron grate, a dozen men shoved the thick, heavy inner wooden doors shut, dropping massive, iron-bound oak beams into the brackets to bar them tight. Safe inside the deep throat of the wall, a heavy, exhausted silence returned, broken only by the ragged, desperate breathing of the wildling survivors and the muffled, distant roar of the green fire burning outside. Mance leaned heavily against the cold ice wall of the tunnel, his chest heaving. He wiped a streak of mud from his face, looking across the dim passage at the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. "They are here, Crow," Mance rasped, the heavy reality of the long dark finally settling over them. "I know," Mormont replied grimly, his face set in hard lines. Mormont did not linger in the tunnel to trade tales of the fire. The duty of the watch was clear. He turned away from the heavy wooden doors and walked swiftly up the long, winding wooden stairs of the king's tower, his heavy boots echoing in the quiet keep. He climbed until he reached the rookery, high above the courtyards of Castle Black. The air in the rookery was thick with the smell of bird droppings and dry straw. 100 black ravens shifted nervously in their cages. The birds' black feathers were puffed out to the absolute maximum against the unnatural cold creeping steadily up the wall. Mormont walked to the small wooden writing desk. He did not ask his maester to pen the letters. The Lord Commander pulled 2 small, crisp pieces of parchment from a drawer. He dipped a quill in black ink and wrote a single, blunt sentence on both scrolls. He tied the scrolls tightly with black thread. He walked to the cages, pulling 2 of the largest, strongest ravens from their roosts. He bound the small scrolls carefully to the birds' legs, securing the leather straps. Mormont carried the ravens to the high, open window of the tower. The gray sky above the southern lands was clear, offering a fast, open flight path. To Winterfell, Mormont muttered quietly to the first bird, casting it out into the wind. To King's Landing, he said to the second, releasing it into the cold air. The ravens did not soar gracefully. The air was too heavy with dread. They dropped heavily for a terrifying second before desperately flapping their wings to catch the updraft, fighting to flee the encroaching death. Mormont watched the 2 black birds beat their wings hard as they flew south, carrying the heavy, inescapable truth to the Lord of Winterfell and the hand of the king. The dead have made their move. Chapter 152, The Call of the Winter. The Godswood of Winterfell was a haven of thick, damp heat against the bitter, howling winds of the northern winter. The deep, boiling black pools hidden among the roots sent thick columns of gray steam rising into the dense canopy of the sentinel pines and ancient oaks, keeping the earth soft and the air comfortably warm. High above the moss-covered ground, standing on a wide, sturdy wooden balcony built out from the side of the guest keep, Eddard Stark rested his calloused hands on the timber railing. He wore a simple tunic of dark gray wool. The deep, heavy exhaustion that had plagued him years ago had settled into a quiet, enduring iron. Beside him stood Lady Ashera, wrapped in a thick shawl of deep purple, and Princess Elia Martell, wearing the dark orange colors of her homeland. They held cups of warm, spiced wine, the steam curling around their faces as they looked down into the sprawling expanse of the ancient woods. The Godswood was not silent. It rang with the sharp, heavy crack of wood striking wood, the dull thud of heavy boots on the damp earth, and the sharp whistle of arrows cutting through the mist. In the center of a wide, moss-covered clearing near the Heart Tree, 2 brutal sparring matches were taking place simultaneously. Prince Tommen Baratheon, now a towering, thick-muscled youth, gripped a heavy, padded practice warhammer in both hands. His black hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat, his jaw locked tight. He swung the massive weapon in a punishing horizontal arc. Rickard Stark, leaner but possessing the tough, wiry strength of the North, stepped smoothly inside the swing. He did not try to block the crushing weight of the Baratheon's hammer. Drawing on the quiet, heavy currents of the living earth beneath his boots, Rickard allowed the force to guide his footwork. He pivoted sharply, letting the padded hammer whistle past his chest, and brought his own blunted long sword up in a rapid, stinging counterstrike toward Tommen's ribs. But Tommen had learned to temper the storm in his blood. He did not overextend. He anchored his heavy boots into the mud, using his own grip on the old magic to halt the momentum of his massive swing. Tommen dropped his shoulder, catching Rickard's wooden blade on the thick leather haft of his hammer with a loud, jarring clack. "You are too slow on the return, Rickard," Tommen called out, a fierce, breathless grin breaking across his face. He shoved his weight forward, forcing the Stark boy to step backward to maintain his balance. "And you strike like a blind bear," Rickard shot back, his gray eyes shining with the thrill of the spar. Up on the balcony, Ned allowed a faint, proud smile to touch his lips. He watched the 2 boys trade heavy, punishing blows. There was no malice in their strikes, only the deep, unspoken brotherhood forged through bleeding in the same dirt. A dozen paces away from the heavy brawling of the younger boys, a second spar moved with a speed that defied the naked eye. Cregan Stark, the heir to Winterfell, wielded 2 heavy wooden practice swords. He moved with a relentless, driving rhythm, his twin blades forming a continuous, blurring net of attacks. He struck high, low, and across, pressing his opponent backward with the sheer, overwhelming pressure of a winter gale. Arya Stark did not wear heavy armor. She wore a fitted tunic of dark leather, her slender ashwood sword held lightly in a single hand. Cregan brought his left blade down in a heavy, vertical chop while bringing his right blade around in a sweeping cut, intending to trap her completely. Arya did not raise her sword to block. She ducked smoothly beneath the horizontal sweep, stepping directly toward Cregan rather than retreating. With a sudden, focused pull of the force, she used the old magic to push herself slightly, turning her body like water around a stone. She slipped entirely through the narrow gap in Cregan's heavy guard, tapping the pommel of her ashwood sword sharply against his collarbone before dancing 3 paces away. Sitting on a wide, flat stone near the edge of the clearing, watching the blur of the sparring match was Rhaenys Targaryen. She wore a practical gown of thick dark wool, a heavy fur cloak draped over her shoulders to ward off the dampness. Resting comfortably in her lap was her toddler son, Edric Stark. The boy had a thick mop of dark hair and sharp, intelligent gray eyes. When Arya tapped Cregan on the collarbone, young Edric let out a bright, ringing laugh. He cheerfully threw his carved wooden direwolf directly at his father's direction, shouting a mangled, high-pitched northern battle cry. Cregan gave a loud, exasperated sigh escaping his chest. Up on the balcony, Ned cracked a smile at the sheer disrespect the boy showed the heir to Winterfell. "You side with the enemy, little wolf?" Cregan asked his son, feigning a look of deep, wounded betrayal. "Your own father?" Rhaenys laughed softly, pressing a kiss to the top of Edric's dark head. "He simply recognizes superior footwork, my love. You step too heavily when you swing the left blade. She hears you coming." Cregan groaned, shaking his head, but a warm, true smile broke across his face. "Again. And this time, Arya, stand still long enough for me to hit you." "Make me," Arya challenged, raising her ashwood blade. On the far side of the warm black pool, away from the clashing of the wooden swords, stood 3 tall targets woven of tightly bound straw. Alaric Stark stood behind the firing line. He was leaner and quieter than his older brothers. He did not seek the glory of the sword ring. He carried a massive, custom-forged longbow of dark weirwood. His gray eyes were sharp, missing absolutely nothing. Aside from his father, he was the deadliest marksman in the entire North. He watched quietly as the 2 young women stepped up to the firing line, engaged in a friendly game of marksman's wagers. Sansa Stark stood tall and poised. She raised her bow, drawing the heavy string back to her cheek with a smooth, practiced motion. She breathed out slowly, her fingers releasing the string. The arrow hissed through the damp air, burying itself with a solid thud directly into the center ring of the farthest straw target. Beside her stood Princess Myrcella Baratheon. The North had stripped the fragile, delicate silk from the princess. She wore sturdy leather bracers tightly laced over her forearms to protect against the snap of the bowstring. Her black hair was tied back in a simple, practical braid. The tips of her fingers were thick with hard, yellowed calluses. Myrcella raised a beautifully carved bow of pale yew. She notched a long, iron-tipped arrow. She did not tremble, and she did not hesitate. Drawing upon the quiet, heavy strength she had built over her time in the snow, she pulled the heavy string back, anchoring her thumb against her jaw. Her elbow was held perfectly high, the tension resting flawlessly in her back without a single word of instruction needed. She exhaled, letting the string slip smoothly from her fingers. The arrow flew true, striking the straw target with a sharp crack, splintering the very shaft of Sansa's arrow in the center ring. Sansa lowered her bow, offering the princess a warm, proud smile. "A perfect strike, Myrcella. You have won the round." Alaric offered a slow, approving nod from the side. Myrcella lowered the yew bow, a genuine flush of pride coloring her cheeks. Up on the wooden balcony, Ashera leaned against the railing, watching the girls retrieve their arrows. "They have grown so strong, Ned," Ashera murmured, her violet eyes full of quiet affection. "All of them. The years of peace have served them well. The pack is ready." "They are," Ned agreed, his voice a low, heavy rumble. Before Elia could add her own thoughts, the heavy wooden door leading to the balcony groaned open. Maester Luwin stepped out into the damp air of the Godswood. In his frantic urgency, the old maester's heavy boots slipped slightly on a patch of wet, steaming moss on the wooden floorboards. He caught himself awkwardly on the timber railing, his chain of many metals clinking loudly against his collarbone, before thrusting a small, tightly rolled scroll of rough parchment toward his lord. The heavy black wax sealing the scroll was already broken. "Lord Stark?" Luwin gasped, his voice trembling slightly, lacking its usual calm, measured tone. Ned turned away from the railing. He saw the stark pallor of the maester's face. The quiet warmth of the balcony vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden, heavy dread. Ashera and Elia stiffened, their hands tightening around their wine cups. Ned reached out, taking the small scroll from Luwin's shaking fingers. He unrolled the crisp parchment. There was no formal greeting. There were no seals of noble houses or flowery words of courtly grace. There was only a single, bluntly written sentence penned in the sharp, hurried handwriting of Jeor Mormont. Ned read the words, his jaw locked. The gray of his eyes turned as cold and hard as the ice of the wall itself. He slowly lowered the parchment, his heavy leather glove crushing the edges of the paper. "Ned," Ashera whispered, stepping closer to him, her heart pounding against her ribs. "What is it?" "The waiting is over," Ned said, his voice dropping to a harsh, lethal pitch that carried the absolute weight of the winter. Ned stepped past his wife, moving to the very edge of the wooden balcony. He looked down at the sprawling, warm clearing below. "Cregan," Ned's voice boomed over the damp air, echoing loudly against the trunks of the ancient sentinel pines. "Everyone, put the weapons away." Down in the clearing, the clashing of the practice swords stopped instantly. Cregan and Arya lowered their blades, looking up at the high balcony. Tommen and Ricard turned, sensing the heavy, undeniable shift in the atmosphere. Alaric stepped away from the archery targets, his hand dropping to the quiver at his hip. Ned, his voice cutting through the mist with unforgiving authority, commanded, "Come to my solar immediately. All of you." Cregan did not ask questions. He saw the cold iron in his father's posture. He gave a sharp, immediate nod. Ned turned away from the railing, walking past the trembling maester without another word, heading directly for the heavy stone corridors of the great keep to prepare his house for war. Hundreds of leagues to the south, beneath the blistering, unrelenting heat of the Crownlands, the red dust of the royal training yard rose in thick, choking clouds. King Robert Baratheon stood in the center of the heavy, trampled dirt. He wore thick, boiled leather breeches and a sweat-soaked tunic, scorning heavy armor in the suffocating heat of the capital. In his hands, he gripped the massive, dark Valyrian steel haft of Stormbreaker. He swung the massive axehammer with terrifying, brutal force, smashing the heavy Valyrian steel head into a towering, iron-banded oak pell. The sound of the impact cracked like thunder across the yard. The thick oak splintered, heavy chunks of wood flying wildly into the dirt. Robert ripped the blade free from the ruined timber, his chest heaving, sweat pouring down his bearded face. He raised the heavy weapon to strike the splintered wood again. "Your Grace." Robert halted his swing. The dark Valyrian steel hovered inches from the ruined oak. The king turned his head, wiping the sweat from his brow with a thick, calloused forearm. Standing at the edge of the training ring, leaning heavily on his polished cane, was Jon Arryn. The hand of the king looked older, his face lined with deep, heavy exhaustion. But it was not age that made his hands tremble today. Clutched tightly in his frail fingers was a crumpled piece of parchment bearing the broken black seal of the Night's Watch. Robert lowered Stormbreaker, resting the heavy head in the red dust. He looked at the pale, stricken face of his oldest friend and mentor. The king did not need to ask if it was a matter of taxes or trade. He knew the look of a man who had just seen the shadow of the grave. "Speak it, Jon," Robert rumbled, his voice low and heavy. Jon Arryn swallowed hard. He looked up, his faded blue eyes meeting the fierce, unyielding gaze of the king. "A raven from Castle Black," Jon rasped, his voice sounding dry and brittle in the baking heat of the yard. "The winter has come, Robert. The dead have made their move." Robert Baratheon did not roar. He did not throw his head back and laugh, and he did not curse the gods. The jovial, booming king vanished entirely, leaving only the cold, terrifying presence of the demon of the trident. Robert stood in absolute silence for a long moment, the heavy weight of the Valyrian steel resting in his hand. The years of preparation, the forging of the glass, the drilling of the men, it had all been leading to this single, inevitable dawn. "The banners, Jon," Robert commanded, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. It was flat, hard, and absolute. "I will summon the scribes to draft the royal decrees, Your Grace," Jon agreed, leaning on his cane. "We must set a gathering point, perhaps Harrenhal or the twins, to allow the hosts to merge before." "No gathering points," Robert interrupted brutally. "No feasts on the road. No waiting for stragglers." Robert pulled Stormbreaker from the dirt, resting the heavy haft over his broad shoulder. "Send the ravens to every lord paramount south of the neck," Robert ordered, stepping toward the shade of the gallery. Tell them to march their hosts directly up the King's Road to the wall. I do not care if their boots are muddy. I do not care if their supply lines are stretched. If their swords are sharp, they march today. There will be no formalities, and there will be no delays. It will be done, Your Grace. John nodded firmly, turning to leave. And John, Robert called out, halting the old man in his tracks. The king's blue eyes darkened, carrying a lethal, uncompromising threat. Send a specific raven to Pike, Robert instructed softly. Tell Balon Greyjoy that I expect the Iron Fleet to drop anchor at Eastwatch by the Sea before the moon turns. John frowned slightly. The Ironborn are notoriously slow to answer the call of the mainland, Robert. They care little for the wars of the Greenlands. Make sure Balon understands the cost of his pride. Robert growled, his voice dropping to a lethal pitch. Tell him that if his ships are not waiting at the ice, I do not care about the dead. I will turn my vanguard around, march straight to the western coast, and burn the Iron Islands down to the bedrock before I ride north. Remind the old squid that my hammer has tasted the walls of Pike before. Tell him that this time, I won't leave a single stone standing for his reavers to cling to. Jon Arryn saw the cold, absolute truth in the king's eyes. It was not an idle threat. Robert would happily crush the squids if they dared to defy the survival of the realm. I will make the terms explicitly clear, Your Grace, Jon promised. I will announce a small council meeting within the hour. Do, Robert grunted, reaching for a heavy iron flagon of water resting on a nearby bench. And fetch my son. Jon paused, turning back slightly. Prince Joffrey, Your Grace? The Crown Prince, Robert confirmed, taking a long, desperate swallow of the cold water. Joffrey Baratheon had returned to the capital a year ago, heavily molded by the brutal, unyielding discipline of Tywin Lannister. The boy was no longer the whining, soft child who had been dragged away to Casterly Rock. He wore dark leathers, spoke with cold politeness, and kept his back perfectly straight. But Robert knew the truth of men. He knew that polished manners and a straight spine did not make a warrior. Have the boy attend the council meeting today, Robert commanded, tossing the empty iron flagon aside. And tell him to pack his armor. He does not stay here in the Red Keep to hide behind his mother's skirts while the realm bleeds. Robert gripped the haft of his Valyrian weapon, his eyes looking past the red dust of the yard, staring toward the northern horizon. He will march in the vanguard with me, Robert declared, his voice carrying the harsh, unyielding reality of the crown. A king leads from the front, Jon. It is time the boy learned what the throne truly costs. Chapter 153, The Steel and the Storm. The heavy, unending scratch of quills against thick parchment entirely consumed the high solar of Winterfell. The hearth fire burned hot, fighting the bitter chill seeping through the thick granite walls. But the three people sitting around the massive oak desk paid it no mind. They worked with the ruthless, synchronized efficiency of a seasoned war council. Eddard Stark pressed his heavy iron seal into a pool of hot black wax, marking a missive bound for the rills. He tossed the sealed scroll to the edge of the desk and reached immediately for a fresh piece of parchment. Sitting to his right, Lady Ashera Stark was penning orders to Deepwood Motte and Bear Island, her elegant handwriting sharp and entirely devoid of pleasantries. To his left, Princess Elia Martell sealed a letter bound for the Bogs of the Neck, commanding the Crannogmen to prepare the causeway for the heavy passage of the marching hosts. The Karstarks will march directly to Eastwatch by the Sea, Ned stated, his voice a low, gravelly hum as he dipped his quill into the inkwell. Lord Ricard is a harsh man, but he holds a true line. He will take command of the eastern fort. And the Shadow Tower? Ashera asked without looking up from her parchment. I am sending Ben-Jen, Ned answered, writing the orders for his brother. Ben-Jen will leave Sea Dragon Point and take command of the Western Gorge. Ser Arthur Dayne, Jon, and Anna will ride with him. They are the finest blades we have, and the Shadow Tower sits nearest to the treacherous mountain passes. They will need the heavy steel. That leaves Castle Black, Elia noted quietly, pouring a fresh pool of wax onto a finished letter. I will take Castle Black, Ned confirmed, his gray eyes hard as glacier ice. Great Jon Umber will ride with me. We will hold the center gate. Before Ned could reach for another scroll, the heavy oak doors of the solar pushed open. The quiet, focused tension of the room shifted as the youth of Winterfell poured through the threshold. Cregan Stark led the way, his face flushed from the freezing air of the training yard. Behind him came Ricard, Arya, Sansa, and Alaric. Bringing up the rear, their faces still damp with sweat from the sparring ring, were Prince Tommen and Princess Myrcella Baratheon. The heavy, jovial mood they usually carried from the yard was absent. Ned set his quill down. He looked at his children, and at the royal wards he had sworn to protect. He did not soften his words. A wolf did not hide from the winter. The king beyond the wall has been pushed to the edge of the ice, Ned announced, his voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of the true north. The dead have made their move. The Night King is marching on the wall. A heavy, absolute silence fell over the Solar. There were no gasps of fear. There were no panicked whispers. The children of Winterfell had been raised in the shadow of this exact truth. Sansa's posture straightened, her hands folding neatly in front of her. Ricard's jaw locked tight. Arya's hand drifted instinctively toward the hilt of her Ashwood practice sword. "I am leaving for Castle Black immediately," Ned declared, standing up from his heavy chair. "I will take an escort of 20 men from the wolf pack." Cregan stepped forward, his back perfectly straight. "Father, you will take command of the main host," Ned instructed, handing his eldest son the heavy burden of the northern armies. "You will marshal the bannermen as they arrive at Winterfell, organize the supply trains, and march them up the King's Road to join me at Castle Black. Bring every last barrel of pitch and every shard of dragonglass we possess." "It will be done," Cregan promised, a fierce, cold readiness in his gray eyes. Ned turned his gaze to the younger wolves. "Ricard, Arya, you will march with Cregan and the main host. You will command the flanks." Arya offered a sharp, eager nod, while Ricard simply tapped his fist against his chest in acknowledgement. "Sansa, Alaric," Ned continued, his voice softening only a fraction. "You will remain here. You will hold Winterfell. Keep the glasshouses warm and ensure the supply lines moving north do not break. The castle must stand strong behind us." Alaric gave a firm nod, understanding the quiet, vital duty of the rearguard. Sansa bowed her head respectfully. "Winterfell will not fail, father." Ned finally turned his eyes to the two black-haired children standing near the door. "Prince Tommen, Princess Myrcella," Ned said gently, "you will remain within these walls. Sandor Clegane and the castle guard will ensure your absolute safety." Tommen stepped forward, his eyes flashing with sudden, stubborn pride. The soft boy of the capital was gone, replaced by a thick-muscled youth who had bled in the northern dirt. "Lord Stark, I have trained every day," Tommen protested, his voice deep and earnest. "I have learned to hold the line. I am a Baratheon. Let me march with Cregan. Let me fight." Ned looked at the boy. He saw the true iron in Tommen's blood, the courage that his father had always hoped to find. But Ned shook his head. "You are brave, Tommen," Ned said firmly, "but you are the blood of the king, and you are my ward. I cannot order the royal heir into the vanguard. That is a decision only your father can make. When King Robert arrives with the southern hosts, you may ask him for a place in the line. Until then, as long as you are under my roof, you are my responsibility, and you will stay behind the granite walls." Tommen frowned, his fists clenching at his sides, but he did not argue further. He understood the hard, unyielding laws of the North. He offered a stiff, respectful nod. Ned turned back to his eldest son. "Cregan, when you march the army out of the gates, bring the Valyrian steel. Every blade, every dagger, every spearhead we pulled from the ash. We will arm the lords when they reach the ice." "I will bring it all, father," Cregan swore. "Good," Ned grunted. He stepped out from behind the heavy oak desk. "Wait here." Ned walked out of the Solar, moving swiftly through the stone corridors of the Great Keep. He bypassed his bedchambers entirely, walking down the narrow, torchlit stairs that led deep into the foundations of the castle. He reached the heavy iron door of his private vault, turning the thick iron key in the lock. The vault smelled of old dust and heavily oiled leather. Resting on long wooden racks were the wrapped bundles of raw Valyrian steel he had plundered from the smoking sea. But Ned did not look at the bundles. He walked to a heavy weapons rack standing in the center of the room. For the true war, Ned knew the massive two-handed greatsword ice would be too slow against the blinding speed of the White Shadows. He needed speed, and he needed absolute precision. He reached out, taking two custom-forged hand-and-a-half swords from the rack. The twin blades were flawless. The dark, rippling metal drank the dim light of the vault. The hilts were wrapped in dark, boiled leather, the pommels forged into the shape of snarling wolf heads cast in solid iron. He had forged them specifically for this coming night. Ned strapped the heavy, twin leather scabbards to his hips. He rested his hands on the hilts, feeling the perfect, lethal balance of the ancient metal. He named the right blade Winter and the left blade Justice. He turned back to the racks. He gathered 3 more weapons, wrapping them securely in thick wool, and walked back up the stairs. When Ned returned to the solar, the children were waiting exactly where he had left them. He walked to the center of the room, laying the heavy woolen bundle onto the polished oak table. He pulled the wool back. The dark, watery ripples of Valyrian steel caught the firelight, drawing sharp gasps from the young warriors. Ned picked up the first weapon. It was a slender, beautifully balanced short sword, forged in the swift, narrow style of the Braavosi water dancers, but made entirely of the dark, spell-forged metal. He held the hilt out toward Arya. "You fight with speed, Arya," Ned said quietly. "Common steel will shatter against the cold. This will not." Arya reached out, her fingers closing reverently around the leather grip. The sword was impossibly light, yet it carried a heavy, lethal promise. She gave it a single, swift swing through the air. It whistled cleanly. "What will you name it?" Ned asked. Arya looked at the dark, razor-sharp point. A fierce, predatory smile touched her lips. "Needle, because it is small, and it will sew the dead shut." Ned offered a proud nod. He reached for the second weapon. It was a hand-and-a-half long sword, broad and heavy, meant for a warrior who fought with driving, relentless pressure. He offered the hilt to Ricard. Ricard took the blade with both hands. He felt the cold, ancient power of the metal settling into his bones. He looked up at his father, his gray eyes shining with fierce determination. "I will name it Shadow Cleaver," Ricard declared, his voice steady. Ned turned back to the table. He picked up the final weapon. It was not a sword. It was a warhammer. It was forged in a similar style to the massive weapon Ned had gifted to King Robert, but it was scaled down. It was lighter, swifter, with a wicked iron spike on the reverse side of the crushing hammer face. The head was forged entirely of dark Valyrian steel, bound to a thick haft of pale ash wood. Ned walked over to Prince Tommen. He held the heavy weapon out. Tommen's green eyes went completely round. He stared at the dark, rippling steel, entirely speechless. "You will stay in Winterfell, Tommen," Ned said, his voice a low, heavy rumble. "But if your father arrives and commands you to join the line, you will not march into the snow with practice wood. Take it." Tommen reached out with trembling, blistered hands. He gripped the thick ash wood. The weapon was heavy, perfectly suited to the broad-shouldered strength he had built in the northern dirt. He held the hammer across his chest, the sheer, impossible value of the gift settling heavily on his young shoulders. "What is its name?" Ned asked. Tommen looked at the dark Valyrian steel, feeling the deep, heavy power of his Baratheon blood rising in his chest. "Thunder," Tommen said, his voice dropping to a fierce, steady pitch. "Because it follows the storm." Ned offered a slow, approving nod. He looked around the room, taking in the faces of his pack. They were armed. They were ready. The long years of peace were officially dead. Ned stepped forward, wrapping his thick arms around Ashera, holding her tightly for a long, silent moment. He pressed a kiss to Elaya's forehead, then embraced each of his children with the rough, quiet affection of a northern father. "Keep the hearths burning," Ned commanded one last time, pulling his heavy fur cloak over his shoulders. He turned and walked out of the solar. Down in the main courtyard, 20 hardened men of the wolf pack sat atop their sturdy garrons, their heavy spears resting in their hands, their gray cloaks blowing in the biting wind. The giant direwolf, Loki, paced near the open iron gates, waiting for his master. Ned mounted his heavy warhorse. He did not look back at the high balconies or the stone towers. He pulled his reins hard, and the small, heavily armed company rode out into the blinding white snow, rushing north to meet the end of the world. Hundreds of leagues to the south, the heavy oak doors of the small council chamber in the Red Keep swung open. The air in the corridor was thick with the suffocating heat of the capital, but the men stepping out of the chamber looked as though they had just been plunged into a frozen lake. King Robert Baratheon had just delivered the Raven's message. For 7 years, the lords of the southern kingdoms had drilled their men, hoarded their grain, and forged weapons of black glass. They had lived with the terrifying memory of the rotting, blue-eyed corpse Eddard Stark had thrown onto the floor of the Great Hall. They had prepared for the true war. But as the heavy reality of the march finally fell upon them, every man in the corridor realized the cold truth. No amount of preparation ever truly makes a man ready to face death. Mace Tyrell wiped a thick sheen of sweat from his broad forehead with a silk handkerchief. The master of coin looked pale, his chest heaving slightly. "The grain," Mace muttered, his voice trembling. "The silos in the reach are bursting, but moving it all up the King's Road. The mud will freeze. The wagon wheels will snap. If the supply lines fail before we even reach the bogs of the Neck, the host will starve in the snow." "Then you put the grain on the ships, Tyrell?" Stannis Baratheon snapped, his jaw grinding audibly. The master of ships looked entirely unfazed by the panic, his pale blue eyes cold and calculating. "We will sail the heavy provisions directly to White Harbor and Eastwatch. The royal fleet is ready. I will tear the docks apart and load every vessel we have. The sea will not freeze." Prince Oberyn Martell leaned casually against the stone wall of the corridor. He was tossing a small, wickedly sharp throwing dagger from hand to hand, but his dark eyes held a fierce, lethal intensity. "The spears of Dorne have grown restless waiting in the sand," Oberyn noted, catching the dagger smoothly by the hilt. "My brother has already ordered the levies to gather at the Boneway. We are accustomed to the heat, not the frost, but a spear thrusts just as well in the snow. I will lead the Dornish host myself. I have grown tired of killing men. I want to see if the dead can bleed." Ser Brynden Tully, the master of war, walked past them. The Blackfish did not stop to chat. His weathered, heavily scarred face was set in lines of absolute, unyielding iron. He carried a heavy roll of maps under his arm. He had spent 7 years drawing battle lines, calculating the exact marching speeds of heavy infantry, and plotting the defensive trenches of the north. Now, the ink had to be turned into blood. "Send the ravens to Riverrun," Brynden ordered a waiting scribe as he strode down the hall. "Tell Edmure to raise the river lords immediately. They are to march to the Twins and secure the crossing for the southern hosts. No delays." The capital erupted into frantic, organized chaos. The bells of the Red Keep began to ring, not in celebration, but with the steady, heavy tolling of war. A few corridors away, Crown Prince Joffrey walked briskly toward his private apartments. He moved with the measured, disciplined strides his grandfather had beaten into him, his back perfectly straight. He had sat at the heavy oak table during the small council meeting, maintaining a flawless mask of cold Lannister stone while the king roared about the marching dead. He had not flinched, not even when his father had looked him dead in the eye and ordered him to pack his heaviest plate armor to ride in the royal vanguard. But as the heavy oak doors of his chambers closed behind him, sealing him alone in the quiet room, the flawless mask finally slipped. Joffrey was still a coward in his blood. The thought of facing rotting, walking corpses in the freezing snows of the north sent a sickening, visceral chill down his spine. He swallowed hard, his hands dropping to the hilt of his sword. His knuckles turned stark white as he gripped the leather tightly, his fingers trembling with sudden, heavy dread. He hated his father. He despised the North. But Tywin Lannister had hammered the outward whining entirely out of him. Joffrey knew that if he refused the command or wept for his mother, he would be stripped of his authority and mocked by the entire realm. He felt the crushing, terrifying weight of the true war pressing down on his shoulders, but he forced his jaw shut. He would march. He would hide his fear behind a wall of heavy steel, and he would let the brutes of the vanguard bleed first. Far to the west, deep within the impenetrable stone halls of Casterly Rock, the message arrived. Tywin Lannister sat behind his massive oak desk in his private solar. The roaring hearth cast long shadows over the rich crimson carpets. In his hand, he held a small, unrolled piece of parchment bearing the heavy black wax seal of the hand of the king. Tywin read the words in absolute silence. Standing on the far side of the room, looking out the narrow window at the crashing waves of the sunset sea, was his brother, Ser Kevan Lannister. Kevan turned away from the glass, his face lined with quiet concern. He wore simple, functional armor, having spent the last 7 years overseeing the mining of the black glass along the western coasts. Tywin slowly lowered the parchment to the desk. He did not sigh, nor did he show a single ounce of fear. "The king has called the banners," Tywin stated, his voice a low, heavy rumble that carried the absolute authority of the West. "The dead are marching on the wall." Kevan swallowed hard, stepping toward the desk. "We have mined the glass, Tywin. The levees are drilled. Preparation is the duty of the living," Tywin replied, rising slowly from his heavy chair. He unclasped his opulent, gold-threaded velvet doublet and let it fall carelessly to the floor. He physically abandoned the rich Lannister crimson for the grim, heavy iron needed for survival. Order the squires to fetch my heaviest battle plate. We march for the Kingsroad. Kevin gave a single, stiff nod. I will summon the lords of the West immediately. Tywin Lannister looked past his brother, his gaze shifting to the heavy stone walls of his ancestral fortress. He had spent his entire life building the wealth and legacy of his house, hoarding gold and demanding respect. But the Raven's message carried a truth that gold could not buy. Tell them to gather their steel and food, Tywin ordered, walking toward the heavy oak doors of the Solar. The Lannisters pay their debts. It is time to pay the dead. More. Chapter 154, The Lines of Defense. The journey up the Kingsroad was cold and steady. The heavy snows of the northern winter had begun to fall in earnest, covering the landscape in a thick, unbroken layer of white. Yet the horses did not struggle, and the riders did not need to slow their pace. The hard, paved stone of the northern roads, forged from crushed rock and ash, provided a solid, even surface that prevented the deep, freezing mud that usually plagued marching armies. A few days after his departure from Winterfell, Eddard Stark reached the environs of Castle Black. He rode at the head of a small column, accompanied by Lord Greatjon Umber and 20 guardsmen of the Wolfpack. As they approached the shadow of the wall, the sheer scale of the wildling presence became clear. The fields and clearings south of the tree line were entirely covered by the camps of the free folk. The tents were organized in dense clusters, with hundreds of simple hearth fires burning steadily to ward off the cold. The wildlings moved about the camps with a quiet, persistent focus, repairing their weapons and tending to their draft animals. Ned pulled his horse to a halt near the main gates of Castle Black. Waiting for him in the freezing courtyard were Lord Commander Jeor Mormont and Mance Rayder. Ned dismounted, handing his reins to a waiting brother of the Night's Watch. Greatjon Umber swung down from his massive draft horse, his heavy boots crunching in the packed snow. Lord Commander, Ned greeted him plainly, offering a short nod. He turned to the wildling king. Mance. Lord Stark, Mormont replied. The perimeter is secure. We have kept the fires burning. The camps are holding, Mance added, his tone strictly practical. But the cold is deepening. My people are managing the rations, but housing 100,000 souls against the ice is a hard task. We will discuss the provisions inside, Ned said. Bring your leaders. We have plans to finalize. The men walked across the courtyard and entered the Lord Commander's Solar in the King's Tower. The room was plain and functional, dominated by a large, scarred wooden table and a single roaring hearth fire. Ned took a seat at the head of the table, pulling off his thick leather gloves. Greatjon Umber stood near the fire, while Jeor and Mance took seats opposite each other. Ned did not waste time with formalities. He looked directly at the king beyond the wall. Mance, separate your people, Ned instructed flatly. The women who cannot fight, the young children, and the elders cannot remain in these camps. They consume daily rations, and they will be a severe liability when the fighting begins. If the wall is breached, they will be trapped. We agreed on this. They will be sent to the new gift immediately. Lord Umber's men are already waiting there with provisions. Mance weighed the reality of starvation and exposure against the march. He gave a slow, firm nod. I will speak to the clan leaders. I will have them gather the women and children by midday. A detachment of my Wolfpack guardsmen will escort them, Ned added. They will ensure an orderly march down the paved roads and coordinate with the Umber garrisons upon arrival. Once the weak and the elders are relocated, your remaining warriors will have unrestricted access to the supply trains. With the matter of the march settled, Ned shifted the focus of the meeting to the enemy. What is the movement of the Night King's army? Ned asked, looking at the Lord Commander. There has been no attack, Jeor Mormont reported firmly. Since the first assault and the ignition of the wildfire trench, the dead have held their position in the deep woods. Our rangers report no skirmishes along the tree line. They are simply waiting. Ned nodded, turning his attention back to Mance. How many dead does he have under his banner? Mance's expression hardened into a grim, stoic line. He did not exaggerate or raise his voice. He delivered the facts as he had seen them. We could not count them, Mance answered plainly. The numbers are too vast. It is not just the wildlings who fell in the snow. It looks like every living thing that has died in the true north since the Age of Heroes has been raised. Men, giants, bears, and ancient beasts. The horde fills the valleys. Ned kept his face entirely blank, processing the grim truth of the numbers. A heavy silence settled over the room as the men acknowledged the sheer scale of the threat. "The numbers are vast," Ned stated finally, tapping a finger against the wooden table. "But the dead cannot simply march through the ice. The wall has ancient magic woven into its foundation. It was built to repel the white shadows, and it will hold the center." Ned leaned forward, tracing a line along the map from Castle Black toward the eastern and western coasts. "The danger is not a direct assault on the gates," Ned explained, his tone cold and measured. "The danger is the geography. As the winter deepens and the temperatures drop further, the sea at Eastwatch will freeze solid. To the west, the river in the gorge near the Shadow Tower will turn to thick ice. When the water freezes, the magic of the wall is bypassed. The dead will be able to simply march around the edges." Jeor Mormont nodded heavily in agreement. "The shores are our weak points. The ice will provide them a flat, unwarded bridge. That is when they will breach," Mance agreed, recognizing the truth of the terrain. "Then we will fortify the shores," Ned decided, finalizing their immediate plans. "We will do what we can for the time being. We hold our current positions. We conserve our provisions and our firewood. We will wait for the southern armies to arrive. And until then, we focus all our defensive efforts on guarding the frozen coasts." The men in the room nodded in unison. There were no grand declarations or impassioned speeches. The orders were clear, the strategy was set, and the meeting was adjourned. By midday, the wildling camps were in motion. Following Mance Raider's orders, the free folk began separating their people. The seasoned warriors, both men and spearwives, remained in the camps with their weapons. The women who could not fight, the elderly, and the young children were gathered near the King's Road. They carried only their clothes and small bundles of personal belongings, leaving the heavy tents and provisions behind for the fighters. The Wolfpack guardsmen, clad in their gray cloaks, took charge of the march. They moved through the crowds efficiently, organizing the tens of thousands of wildlings into steady, manageable columns. Great John Umber's soldiers brought forward long, flat-bottomed wooden sledges pulled by draft horses to carry those who were too old or too weak to make the march on foot. As the massive column began to move south, the wildlings stepped onto the paved stone of the King's Road. They were accustomed to walking through deep, treacherous snowdrifts and uneven, rocky terrain. The hard stark stone was cambered slightly in the center, allowing the melted snow to drain away into side ditches. The road was solid, unyielding, and entirely clear of the exhausting knee-deep mud they had expected. The steady, reliable footing allowed the massive column to move at a rapid, continuous pace. Within a few days, the escorted wildlings arrived in the new gift. Sturdy holdfasts built of thick stone blocks and hard mortar dotted the hillsides. The Umber garrison stationed at the holdfasts guided the wildlings inside. There was no confusion. The women and children were directed into large, communal halls heated by central stone hearths. They were shown the deep cellars, which were stacked high with wooden crates of salted beef, dried fish, and thick root vegetables. The relocation was completely orderly. The wildling elders sat by the warm fires, realizing that they were not prisoners in a foreign land. They had been brought to a secure, heavily provisioned sanctuary, exactly as the Warden of the North had promised. Meanwhile, the gathering of the swords proceeded with exact, calculated precision across the north. The northern lords did not gather in a single, vulnerable mass. Following the ravens sent from Winterfell, the armies split, making their way slowly and deliberately to their designated castles along the wall. Lord Rickard Karstark led his spearmen eastward, marching through the biting wind toward Eastwatch by the sea. When the Karstark forces arrived at the coastal fortress, Lord Rickard did not waste time resting his men. He walked directly to the freezing shoreline, evaluating the lie of the beach. The sea was already thick with slush, the edges of the water beginning to harden into a solid sheet of gray ice. Rickard Karstark ordered his men to begin digging deep trenches into the frozen sand near the shoreline. A spearman brought a heavy iron pick down hard, only for the thick oak haft to shatter completely against the permafrost, the sand frozen as hard as an anvil. Karstark grunted, ordering his men to burn pitch fires directly over the sand to thaw the earth before they could even break the ground for their spikes. Once the earth yielded, they carved wide ditches lined with barrels of pitch. He positioned his archers on the high stone battlements of Eastwatch, ensuring they had clear, overlapping fields of fire covering the frozen sea. Every spearman was issued a dragonglass blade, and they established strict patrol rotations along the ice edge. Far to the west, a different defense was being established. Benjen Stark rode into the courtyard of the Shadow Tower, accompanied by Sir Arthur Dayne, Jon Stark, and Anna. The western fortress sat near the edge of a massive, plunging gorge. The only crossing point was the Bridge of Skulls, a narrow, treacherous span of stone that hung precariously over the deep river below. Benjen took command of the Night's Watch garrison, organizing the supply lines and checking the grain stores. Arthur Dayne took charge of the physical defenses. Arthur walked the length of the Bridge of Skulls, his veteran eyes noting every angle and choke point. He did not rely on the narrow bridge alone. He directed the garrison to construct heavy wooden barricades at the southern end of the crossing, forcing any advancing force into a tight, easily defensible bottleneck. Jon Stark and Anna worked in tandem with the archers. They oversaw the construction of elevated wooden blinds built into the sides of the gorge. These blinds provided cover from the wind and offered the archers a protected, elevated vantage point to rain down dragonglass arrows upon the bridge. The preparations were methodical. Weapons were sharpened, watch schedules were formalized, and the defenders settled into a routine of strict vigilance. In the center of the north, Cregan Stark led the main host out of the gates of Winterfell. The army was vast, comprised of heavy infantry, armored cavalry, and a massive supply train of wooden sledges. Cregan rode at the front of the column, maintaining a steady, relentless pace. Rickard Stark and Arya Stark rode on the flanks, ensuring the column remained tight and disciplined. The wagons behind them were loaded not only with grain and pitch, but with the heavy wooden crates containing the Valyrian steel weapons retrieved from the Winterfell vaults. The march up the King's Road was uneventful. The paved stone allowed the heavy sledges to glide smoothly over the terrain, moving the bulk of the northern military might toward Castle Black without delay. While the north fortified its positions, the massive armies of the southern kingdoms were already on the move. The response to King Robert's absolute command was swift and devoid of political hesitation. The great lords of Westeros had spent 7 years preparing for this exact moment, and their supply trains engaged immediately. The movement of the southern forces was a sprawling, continent-wide operation, executed through 2 distinct paths, by land and by sea. On the narrow sea, the master of ships, Stannis Baratheon, managed the ships and the sea stores. At Dragonstone, Stannis oversaw the loading of hundreds of heavy transport cogs. The docks operated day and night. Men carried heavy crates of raw dragonglass, mined from the deep caverns of the island, loading them directly into the hulls of the ships. Simultaneously, the fleet of the Reach, commanded by Paxter Redwine, loaded massive quantities of grain, salted pork, and winter provisions from the fertile southern lands. The ships sailed in tight, organized convoys, utilizing the favorable autumn winds to travel quickly up the eastern coast. Half of the fleet set its course for White Harbor, where the provisions would be offloaded and transported up the White Knife River. The other half sailed directly for the freezing waters of Eastwatch by the Sea, delivering the dragonglass and food directly to the front lines. The naval route bypassed the slow, muddy roads of the southern kingdoms entirely, ensuring the necessary supplies reached the north before the heaviest snows fell. On land, the marching of the southern armies was a slow, grueling process of sheer endurance. King Robert Baratheon rode at the head of the royal vanguard. He set a brutal, punishing pace, riding his black destrier. He did not stop for comfort, and he did not allow the column to rest in the towns they passed. Riding a few paces behind the king was Crown Prince Joffrey. The young prince wore heavy, plain plate armor, devoid of any gold inlay or royal decoration. He sat stiffly in his saddle, his face pale from the cold wind. He did not speak. Tywin Lannister rode alongside the prince, ensuring that Joffrey maintained his posture and did not show a single sign of weakness to the marching men. The old lion watched the boy closely, enforcing the strict, silent discipline of Casterly Rock throughout the long march. The host behind them was a massive, moving river of steel and wool. Tens of thousands of infantrymen from the Crownlands, the Stormlands, and the Westerlands marched in tight formation. The burden of moving such a massive force was managed by Ser Brynden Tully. The Master of War rode constantly up and down the length of the column. He checked the supply wagons, ensuring the draft horses were not overworked, and coordinated the foraging parties to ensure the army did not strip the local farmlands bare. He maintained strict order, punishing any soldier caught straggling or breaking formation. The march through the Riverlands was difficult. The autumn rains had turned the dirt roads into a thick, sucking mire. Men struggled to pull their boots from the mud, and wagon wheels frequently sank to their axles, requiring teams of men to heave them free. The pace was frustratingly slow, and the damp cold seeped into the men's bones. However, the agonizing slog changed entirely when the southern host finally reached the borders of the north. As the vanguard passed beneath the imposing, black basalt walls of Moat Cailin, the muddy ruts of the southern roads abruptly ended. The marching infantry stepped onto the smooth, solid surface of the stark stone King's Road. The effect on the army was immediate. The men no longer had to fight the mud with every step. The heavy supply wagons rolled effortlessly over the flat, paved surface. Without the constant delays of sunken wheels and exhausted draft animals, the marching speed of the massive host effectively doubled. The southern soldiers, many of whom had never traveled north of the Neck, marveled quietly at the sheer practicality of the paved roads. The solid stone allowed them to cover ground rapidly, pushing deeper into the freezing landscape with a steady, unbroken rhythm. The continent was converging, from the fortified shores of Eastwatch to the narrow bridge of the Shadow Tower, and down the long, paved expanse of the King's Road, the armies of the living were moving into their designated positions. They marched without songs, without banners raised for glory, focused entirely on reaching the Great Wall of Ice before the freezing waters allowed the dead to cross. Chapter 155: The Splitting of the Swords. The royal vanguard rode through the heavy iron gates of Winterfell as the evening sun dipped behind the western towers. The long ride up the King's Road had been cold and steady, the biting wind of the north serving as a harsh reminder of the war that waited at the end of the world. King Robert Baratheon pulled his massive black destrier to a halt in the center of the main courtyard. He swung his heavy frame down from the saddle, his boots crunching in the packed snow. He wore thick layers of boiled leather and a heavy bear pelt cloak, the Valyrian steel of Stormbreaker resting securely on his back. Waiting to receive the king on the stone steps of the Great Keep was a small, quiet party. Lady Ashera Stark stood at the front, her dark hair bound tightly against the wind, wrapped in a thick cloak of deep purple wool. Beside her stood Sansa and Alaric, offering respectful, disciplined bows. But Robert's blue eyes immediately locked onto the two figures standing on the right side of the steps. Prince Tommen and Princess Myrcella did not look like the soft, frightened children whom had seen in the capital. They had grown sturdy in the cold. Myrcella wore a thick, practical gown of dark wool. Tommen stood with his boots planted firmly shoulder-width apart. Their hair was a thick, unruly mop of coal-black strands, their faces flushed with the healthy, wind-burned red of the north. Robert let out a booming, heavy laugh. The sight of his children, standing strong and uncomplaining in the freezing courtyard, filled his broad chest with deep, immense pride. "Look at you," Robert rumbled, stepping forward and clapping a heavy, leather-clad hand onto Tommen's shoulder. The boy did not flinch under the weight. "You look like a true stag, Tommen. The frost has beaten the soft summer out of you." "Winterfell has been a good home, father," Tommen replied, his voice steady and even. Robert looked down at the heavy iron hammer resting near Tommen's boot. "I see you have not neglected the yard. Are you learning to hold the line?" Tommen gripped the leather haft of his weapon. He looked up at his father, his blue eyes sharp and determined. "I have trained every day, your grace. I know how to hold a shield, and I know how to swing the iron. I do not want to sit behind these walls while the realm fights. I want to march with you to the wall." Ashera Stark stiffened slightly, her violet eyes flashing with quiet concern. Sansa looked at her boots. They all knew the horrors waiting in the deep snow. But Robert Baratheon did not scold the boy. He did not tell him he was too young. The king of Westeros smiled, a fierce, genuine grin breaking through his dark beard. This was exactly what he had always wanted his son to be. A warrior who asked to face the enemy, rather than a coward who hid in the tall towers of the Red Keep. "You want to march into the snow?" Robert asked, testing the boy's resolve. "I do," Tommen answered firmly. "Then pack your furs and fetch your horse," Robert commanded, offering a heavy nod of approval. "A prince of the realm does not hide from the winter. You will ride with the vanguard tomorrow." Tommen's face lit up with fierce pride. "Thank you, father." Robert turned to Ashera. "We will trouble your halls for one night, Lady Ashera. The men need a hot fire and a warm meal before we push into the true cold." "The hearths are lit, your grace, and the meat is roasting," Ashera replied, gesturing toward the heavy oak doors of the keep. "Winterfell is yours." The king and his vanguard spent a single, quiet night within the warm granite walls of the castle. They ate heavily, drank sparingly, and rested their tired bones. When the pale dawn broke the next morning, the column was already mounted. With Tommen riding a sturdy northern Garen near his father's flank, the royal host rode out of the gates, making their way north to join the gathering storm. A few days later, the shadow of the great ice finally fell over the marching host. The lands surrounding Castle Black were entirely unrecognizable. The quiet, empty fields of the Gift had been transformed into a sprawling, chaotic sea of canvas tents, wooden palisades, and smoking hearth fires. The sheer scale of the gathered armies was staggering. As King Robert's column rode into the main courtyard of the Night's Watch, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, wet wool, and packed horses. The Lord Paramounts of the Seven Kingdoms had arrived. The courtyard was a dense crush of armor and banners. The heavy plate steel of the Westerlands stood near the green and gold cloaks of the Reach. The bronze runes of the Vale mingled with the dark iron of the Ironborn. It was the greatest gathering of martial strength in the history of the continent, forced together by the threat of the Long Dark. Robert dismounted, handing his reins to a waiting steward. He did not linger in the yard to exchange pleasantries with the southern lords. He walked directly toward the king's tower, flanked by his Kingsguard and young Tommen. For the next 2 hours, the king of Westeros and the warden of the north sat alone in the cramped, map-covered solar of the Lord Commander, finalizing the heavy task of dividing the continent's swords. When the sun reached its highest point in the overcast sky, the great horn of Castle Black sounded 3 long, low blasts. The doors to the massive, drafty shield hall were thrown open. The great hall of the Night's Watch was a long, cavernous room, its walls lined with the faded, wooden shields of dead brothers. Today it was packed tightly with the most powerful men in the world. The heat of body warmth and the roaring hearth fires made the air thick and stifling. King Robert Baratheon sat at the center of the high table. To his right sat Eddard Stark, his face a mask of cold, unyielding iron. To his left sat Jeor Mormont, the Lord Commander of the Watch. Standing on the far side of the room, keeping a careful distance from the armored knights of the south, were the leaders of the Free Folk. Mance Rayder stood quietly, his arms crossed over his red-slashed cloak. Beside him stood Tormund Giantsbane, glaring openly at the southern lords, and a handful of scarred wildling chieftains. The rest of the hall was a tense, crowded sea of rivalries, packed tightly with both the great Lord Paramounts and the minor lords from every corner of Westeros. Stannis Baratheon, the master of ships, stood stiffly near his younger brother, Renly, the master of laws. Mace Tyrell wiped sweat from his brow, standing beside the hardened, unforgiving figure of Randyll Tarly. Jaime Lannister rested a hand on his sword belt, his eyes scanning the room. Standing near the hearth was Brynden Tully, the master of war, deep in quiet conversation with his nephew Edmure Tully, the new Lord Paramount of the Riverlands. Yohn Royce stood tall in his bronze armor, representing the strength of the Vale alongside Dennis Arryn. Prince Oberyn Martell leaned casually against a wooden pillar, a faint, mocking smile on his lips as he watched the discomfort of the Reach Lords. Near the front of the hall stood the younger blood. Joffrey Baratheon wore dark, heavy plate armor, his face pale and tight, standing near his grandfather's men. He saw Tommen standing proudly with the Stark wolves and instinctively moved to sneer at his younger brother. Before Joffrey could take a single step, Tywin Lannister simply placed a heavy, mailed hand on the boy's shoulder and pushed him down slightly. Joffrey instantly froze, dropping his gaze to the floor, proving that Tywin had completely broken the boy's arrogance. Garland and Loras Tyrell stood together, their fine cloaks looking entirely out of place in the grim, smoke-stained hall. And standing near the back doors, keeping their distance from the Greenland lords, were Balon Greyjoy and his son, Theon. The Lord of the Iron Islands wore a scowl of deep, bitter resentment, forced to the frozen end of the world by the heavy threat of the king's warhammer. The room was filled with the low, buzzing hum of dozens of overlapping conversations. Men argued over supply lines, the bitter cold, and the sheer number of tents required to house the footmen. Robert looked at Ned and gave a single, slow nod of his head. Ned Stark pushed his chair back, the heavy scrape of wood against stone cutting through the noise. He stood up. He did not shout for silence. He simply stepped forward, resting his hands on the edge of the heavy oak table, and looked out over the gathered lords. The slow, crushing weight of his presence settled over the room. The conversations died away, one by one, until the massive hall fell into absolute, breathless silence. "The armies of the living are gathered," Ned began, his voice calm, flat, and echoing loudly off the timber ceiling. "You have marched your men through the mud and the frost. You have brought your steel to the edge of the world. Now you must know where to stand." Ned unrolled a large, heavy map of the wall on the table, pointing to the center. "The Night King cannot breach Castle Black," Ned stated, delivering the tactical truth without embellishment. "The wall is built of solid ice, 700 feet high, and woven with ancient magic. The dead cannot simply break the gates or climb the face. A direct assault on the center is a waste of his horde, and the enemy is not foolish." Ned traced his finger along the map, moving to the far eastern and western edges. "He will wait," Ned explained. "He will hold his host in the deep cover of the haunted forest until the winter deepens. He is waiting for the sea to freeze solid at Eastwatch, and for the deep gorge near the Shadow Tower to ice over. When the water turns to solid frost, the magic of the wall is bypassed. That is where he will cross. That is where we must hold the line." The lords of the south muttered quietly, looking at the map. "We cannot hold both shores if we march as a single, unorganized mass," Ned continued, raising his voice slightly to command the room. "We must split the swords. I propose the following deployment." Ned looked toward the wildling chieftains, then back to the northern lords. "The entire northern army and the entire host of the free folk will march west," Ned ordered. "They will take the Shadow Tower and the mountains of the gorge." Mance Rayder gave a short, confirming nod. "The rest of the combined armies, the Westerlands, the Reach, the Stormlands, the Crownlands, Dorne, the Riverlands, the Vale, and the Ironborn will march east," Ned declared, looking directly at the Lord Paramounts. "You will take Eastwatch by the sea and hold the frozen coast." The division of the armies caused an immediate stir in the hall. Randall Tarley frowned, while Yohn Royce crossed his heavy arms. "You separate the north entirely from the rest of the realm, Lord Stark?" Randall Tarley asked, his harsh voice echoing in the hall. "You leave the eastern shore entirely in the hands of the southern hosts?" "I do, Lord Tarley," Ned answered bluntly, offering no apologies. "And I do it for two very practical reasons. The first is the terrain." Ned pointed to the western edge of the map. "The lands around the Shadow Tower are treacherous. It is a harsh, broken country of deep gorges, narrow mountain passes, and thick, freezing forests. Heavy infantry in plate steel will struggle to hold a line there. The wildlings know how to fight in the high rocks, and the Northmen know how to move through the deep snows of the mountains. They are suited to the west." Ned moved his finger to the eastern edge. "Eastwatch is a flat, open coastline. The sea will freeze into a wide, unbroken plain of ice. That terrain heavily favors the disciplined shield walls of the Westerlands, the massed, organized archery of the Reach and the Vale, and the heavy siege scorpions of Dorne. The south is built to fight on open ground. You will have it at the sea." Ned paused, letting the strategic logic settle into the minds of the seasoned commanders. Brynden Tully gave a slow, approving nod from the side of the room. The Master of War saw the clear advantage of matching the armies to their preferred battlegrounds. "The second reason," Ned continued, his voice dropping to a hard, unyielding pitch, "is the blood." Ned looked directly at the southern lords, then cast a glance at Tormund Giantsbane. "I will not mince words," Ned stated. "You do not trust them, and they do not trust you. If I pack your men into the same camps, we will have drunken brawls, drawn knives, and dead men before the enemy even breaches the tree line. By splitting the hosts, we keep the camps clean. The North will fight beside the free folk. We have somewhat good relationship with them since trade started. The South will fight beside the South. There will be no friendly fire in the dark." The brutal honesty of the statement silenced the remaining murmurs. The lords knew it was true. Forcing a Stormlander pikeman to share a fire with a then raider was a recipe for disaster. "There is one final deployment," Ned said, turning his attention to the Lord of Highgarden. "Lord Mace Tyrell." Mace stiffened, stepping forward slightly, his heavy cloak swishing against the floor. "Yes, Lord Stark. You will not march to Eastwatch," Ned instructed. "You will remain here at Castle Black. You will serve as the anchor for our supply lines. Every wagon of grain, every barrel of pitch, and every crate of dragonglass must flow through this central hub. You will oversee the provisions, ensuring that both the eastern and western fronts remain fed and armed. A reserve force of 5,000 men from the combined armies will remain here to garrison the castle and protect the stores." Mace Tyrell let out a quiet, barely concealed breath of relief. He had dreaded the thought of standing on the frozen ice, facing rotting corpses with a sword in his hand. Overseeing ledgers and organizing wagons in the safety of Castle Black was a task he eagerly accepted. "I understand, Lord Stark," Mace said, puffing his chest out. "House Tyrell will ensure the armies do not starve." Ned looked out over the crowded hall. He met the eyes of Tywin Lannister, Stannis Baratheon, and Balon Greyjoy. "The strategy is set," Ned declared. "Does any man object to this deployment?" The great hall remained completely silent. The logic was sound, the terrain suited the men, and the separation prevented infighting. Ned gave a slow, firm nod to his eldest son. Cregan turned from his place near the wall and signaled to the heavy doors. A dozen guardsmen of the Wolfpack marched into the great hall, carrying several long, heavy wooden boxes. The men set the crates down roughly before the high table. Ned stepped down from the dais. He unlatched the first crate and threw the heavy wooden lid back. The lords of the south strained their necks. Resting inside the rough wood, wrapped in oiled cloth, were dozens of long swords, broadswords, and axes. The dark, smoky ripples of the metal caught the hearth fire. A collective murmur of disbelief rippled through the minor lords and highborn knights alike. It was Valyrian steel. Ned reached into the crate. He did not pull out a standard blade. He drew a massive, ornate greatsword. The gold of its hilt was slightly tarnished by age, but the dark blade was flawless. "Ser Jaime Lannister," Ned called out. Jaime stepped forward, his green eyes widening as he recognized the ancient, legendary descriptions of the blade. "I retrieved this from the ruins of Valyria," Ned stated plainly, handling the priceless weapon as if it were a standard iron spear. "Bright Roar, the ancestral sword of your house. I told King Robert I would return it to Casterly Rock if the Westerlands committed their full strength to the wall. Your father brought the men. The blade is yours." Jaime took the heavy greatsword, for once entirely stripped of his cynical smirk. Tywin Lannister's pale green eyes locked onto the weapon, a rare flash of satisfaction crossing the old lion's face. Ned turned back to the crates. He and Cregan began to hand the remaining Valyrian steel weapons out to the gathered lords. He handed blades to Yohn Royce, Brynden Tully, Jason Mallister, and to the minor lords who commanded the southern vanguard. Ned then walked to the edge of the room. He stopped before the wildling leaders, handing a heavy Valyrian axe to Mance Rayder and a thick broadsword to Tormund Giantsbane. The southern lords bristled slightly at seeing wildlings handed dragon steel, but they did not speak against it. Ned stepped back to the high table, looking out over the heavily armed hall. "Hear me well," Ned continued, his voice hard and uncompromising. "These blades are a loan for the long night. When the dead are broken, the steel is returned to Winterfell. Bright Roar belongs to the Rock, but the rest are mine. If any man wishes to keep his blade after the war is won, he will buy it from House Stark with a heavy sum of gold." Ned felt no worry over the transaction. The weapons he handed out today made up barely a quarter of the raw Valyrian ingots still sitting safely in the deep vaults of Winterfell. If the lords wanted to keep them, the gold would simply rebuild the north. "The armies will break their camps at first light," Ned commanded. "The north and the wildlings march west. The south marches east." Before the lords could turn to leave the hall, Ned raised a heavy, leather-clad hand. "One final warning," Ned said, his tone turning grim and deadly serious. He looked directly at the knights of the Summerlands. "You have marched through the mud, and you have survived the sea. But you are now in the true north. The enemy hiding in the woods is not the only thing that will kill you." Ned leaned forward slightly. "The cold does not care about your plate armor," Ned warned them bluntly. "It does not care about your titles. If your men do not keep their fires burning, they will freeze in their sleep. If they do not change their wet boots, their toes will turn black, and a man with dead feet cannot hold a shield wall. Keep yourselves warm, check your men, keep your sentries alert, and expect the worst. The long night is here, and it will show you no mercy." King Robert stood up from his chair, the heavy scrape of wood signaling the end of the council. He picked up the massive Valyrian steel of Stormbreaker. "You heard the Warden of the North," Robert boomed, his voice carrying the final, absolute authority of the crown. "Get to your camps. Prepare your men. We march at dawn." The lords of Westeros bowed their heads. They turned and filed out of the heavy wooden doors of the shield hall, clutching their dark steel tightly, stepping back into the freezing wind of the courtyard. The time for talking was done. The continent was split, the swords were assigned, and the great hosts prepared to face the ice.